Welcome to today's debate on the topic of language acquisition. Our two speakers will present arguments discussing the similarities and differences between acquiring a first language, L1, and second language, L2. Let's begin with our first speaker, who will focus on the similarities between the two processes.
Thank you. Hi, this is Edwin. While there are notable differences in how the human being acquire our first and second languages, the underlying mechanics of language acquisition share many commonalities. Whether we are learning our first language as a child or a second language as an adult, the processes involve similar core principles. And in this time, I'm going to talk about the three main points, how the L1 and L2 have similarities when we are acquiring a language. Point one, input and exposure. First and foremost, both L1 and L2 acquisition depend heavily on input and exposure. For example, for L1, babies are surrounded by their native language from birth and constantly hearing it and absorbing its pattern with their families, their brothers, and also in the school, for example. And similarly, when learning an L2, the more exposure we have to the language, whether through the conversations, medias, or in this case that we have the technological tools and apps, the more quickly we pick it up, the principle of input being a driving force for acquisition holds true in both cases. Now I'm going to talk about the point number two, that is the contextual learning. We are referring about the similarities. In both L1 and L2, learners benefit from contextual learning, just as a child learns the word, in this case, dog, by seeing and hearing the word in context. L2 learners also associate new vocabulary with situation or objects, whether it's associating, in this case, agua with a glass of water, or xiang with a dog if we are learning French. So learners build meaning through the context in both cases. So referring to this point and trying to explain a little bit more, the image play an important part when we are learning a new language, because the human being also tends to associate image with language and try to explain with the objects or images. Now, I'm going to talk about the point number three, practice and feedback. Another major similarity is the role of practice and feedback. In L1, children learn through experimentation, and their errors are corrected by caregivers. And similarly, in L2, learners refine their skill by practicing the language and receiving feedback from teacher, native speaker, or language apps, as we're talking about the technological tools that are very important nowadays. In both cases, the practice and correction are essential to moving toward fluency. And this, we can see it, for example, when we have people that is with us sharing our space and talk about this language that we are acquiring. So in conclusion, talking about the similarities, so while L1 and L2 learners may acquire language in different life stages, the foundational process of input, context, and practice are remarkably similar. These are universal mechanisms that apply regardless of whether we are learning our first language or picking up a second. So this is my participation, and thank you.
Thank you. Now let's hear from our second speaker, who will focus on the differences between acquiring a first language and a second language.
Thank you very much. As we heard just before, we have listened very valid bullet points and some common factors that yes, they are do valid when we are learning about language acquisition, but I would like to differ a little bit with the steps or the points that my opponent has presented today, because there are a lot of information that it is important for us to check, that it can vary depending on the cognitive process, the time that it takes to learn a language, and any other factor that can differ. And these are my following points. The very first one, it's about the way how we learn a language. And we have two methods. My point number one, it's about explicit and implicit language. With this one, when we talk about this particular stage, we know that children, they do not think about rules because they do not have their cognitive skills developed yet for them to ask about why certain words work that way or why we have certain grammatical structures. They work or they think subconsciously. That's how they learn, through immersion and interaction. That is correct, but there is a difference. With L2 acquisition with any second language, we need to have explicit learning. What does it mean? It means that learners, they are thinking about how to study grammar, how to learn a vocabulary, pronunciation patterns. And this is important because this means that we need to take the time to think about the language that we are going to learn. But with children, it is not the same because they don't follow the same patterns as adults do. That was my first point. Now, if we talk about a second point, and it is a very important thesis, it's about the critical period hypothesis. With this period, it's been shown that children, they acquire a first language during the infancy and before puberty. That means that what happens if we lose this period of time for us to learn a language? It can happen that kids can have issues for them to learn. If we don't take advantage of this stage, there are certain things that we can lose. For example, the accent. Each language can be similar. It can have its similarities, but things like accent, pace, the way how we talk about it, it can differ. That's why language 2 acquisition is more difficult, because after this critical period, all the information about grammar can be changed. The way how adults do have issues learning things because they have other responsibilities to have or to follow, that causes for them to have issues at the time of learning. And my third point, it's about the influence that we can have from a first language to learn a second language. For example, we as native speakers, we are influenced because we already know rules in Spanish, but what happens if we try to move it to another language like English? We can be deeply affected or influenced by the first language. There is a process that's called language transfer. It occurs because we as learners, we try to take the rules that we already know and the structures from our native language to another ones that it can be our second language. That's why this interference creates a unique set of challenges that can affect for us to learn from a first language to a second language. So in conclusion, we can see that it is different because we have a particular time frame where we learn a language. Also, we learn through implicit versus explicit learning as adults. And the last one, because we are influenced by the first language. This has been my points, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so now we have refutation stage, and is language acquisition between L1 and L2 the same? What do you think?
Where I do consider that it is not the same because there are a lot of factors that can change. For example, the first one, or one that you mentioned about learning language, it was about that, yes, kids, they do learn by repeating, by practicing, by looking at what the parents or what the people that they live with do. But it does not mean that the structure or the words that they are learning are correct, because they can repeat, but they don't have consciousness that what they are learning, it is correct or incorrect.
Okay, yeah, and I think that sometimes there are little differences between L1 and L2, and also the question number 2 is language acquisition between L1 and L2 different, and I refer to the point number 2 that you mentioned is about the contextual learning, right? Mm-hmm. That is critical period hypothesis. And I want to refer in this point because not all the children develop the cognitive at the same time or at the same way, because the brain doesn't have the development as usually happen. And this is why, for example, when children mispronounce a word and you have to correct when they say, for example, mention a word and it's not correct, but we have to give feedback. In this case, that they have to learn the correct way to speak. But I refer in this because it happens normally. It happens normally, but not all the children learn at the same way. We have, and we know the methodologies, we have learned about all these aspects that not all the students, also the children and all the people that is learning a new language, also their native language, sometimes there are some errors and new feedback. So there are some points that maybe are not general, but always exists a difference between how do you acquire your mother tongue and a foreign language.
Understandable, yes, and that is, you are correct. That is a valid point. However, it is important that to keep in mind that the way how things get processed, they can change because, for example, kids, they don't even have their babies, they don't have their motor skills developed. Even we've learned that vocal tracts change. We need to have an L-shape type of tract so we can start pronouncing words, and babies unfortunately cannot do that. So why is language acquisition with a second language not the same? Because we have abilities in our body that are more developed than kids, and that's something that we cannot control. It's just the way how the body changes, and that's why it is important to have that in mind, that it is not the same because there are processes that can vary, and also because we already have an influence with the language that we already know. So we are not going to repeat the same process of, for example, trying to say syllables or try to know that, for example, that the word, as you said, the word dog in Spanish is perro, like by looking at two images or of a dog, and we will know that that is the word. We don't have to think too much. of it because we already know that context. So that's why I do consider that first language acquisition, it's not going to be the same as a second language acquisition. But as we said, these are things that are very common, and that's something that it will always be there in any type of language learning. And yes, that was my input about the topic.
Okay, so this is our presentation about this debate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.